Well, thank you guys for being with us tonight. There's some more books up front if you like to grab a book, and we are going to let Miss Jane take it away, and then we'll come back and have a time of prayer, and then get into our study. So, Miss Jane, take it away.
Okay, we're going to try and sing a Christmas carol every week until Christmas. So if you turn to page 180, and y'all, I got new glasses, but I cannot see from here to where my book is. So if I start, y'all go on without me. So I'm just going to say it is what it is. And then it's page 180, and we've had a request for Amazing Grace again, and it's page 104 if you need a book. And we'll do 2 or 3 verses of that, and we'll try to do 1, 3, and 4 of the first Noel. page 104. Oh, golly. Let's see. 1, 2, and 5. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun.
Thank you, Miss Jane. Always enjoy having you sing and lead us in those songs. Tonight we're going to be picking back up in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5. It's been a couple weeks since we've been together to study 1 Corinthians. So just kind of to remind you of where we've been at, we began last time in chapter 3, this idea that Paul calls out the Corinthians primarily for their spiritual immaturity. He tells them that, you should be walking in maturity now, but you're still, for lack of better terminology, you're still wearing diapers. Imagine an adult, a fully grown adult wearing diapers, walking around. That's the image that he gives here of one who is mature, or who is physically mature, but yet not spiritually mature. And then in verse 5, he's going to basically get to the heart of the issue here. And what had happened here in 1 Corinthians 3 is the Corinthians had a misguided perception of the nature of the church and its leadership, especially the roles of teachers. And so Paul sets out to correct their understanding with 3 images from agriculture and also from architecture. And so he begins in verse 5 of 1 Corinthians 3. He says, "What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers, you are God's field, God's building. And so he, as I mentioned to you, he uses three metaphors. These are the metaphors that he uses in verses 5 through 9. What we looked at, he uses this farming metaphor. And so here, what Paul describes is the idea that Paul and Apollos and any pastor who would serve the Corinthian church are just simply servants of God. There's nothing particularly special about them other than God's calling upon their life. They're just ordinary folks just like you and me, but it's easy for us to put pastors and leaders up on a pedestal for which they don't need to be on. And so he reminds them in verses 6 through 7 that God is the one who is responsible for any growth that takes place. Remember, he says, Apollos, I planted. Apollos is the one who watered, but God is the one who gave the increase. He's the one who allowed the growth to happen. And he reminds also the church in verse 9 that not only is God the one responsible for growth, but he's the one who owns the field. He says, for we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field. You are God's building. And so he reminds us that both the worker and the farm, as well as the servants, we all belong to the Lord. And so Paul here is emphasizing the differences. There is a difference between the ministry that Paul had and the ministry that Apollos had. Paul is the one who started the work. Apollos is the one who built upon the work that Paul had established. Both of them are equally important. And one is really not more important than the other, or more distinct, or more celebrated, ought to be more celebrated than the other. And so what was going on, just kind of cut to the chase, was there was some groups, as he alludes to in the first part of chapter 3, that are these factions of people. There's a group over here that says that, Apollos is our pastor. We like him. Some were like, no, we really don't care much for him. We want to follow Paul. Others were like, we don't really care for either one of them. We like Peter. There's others that say we don't really care about all three of them. We're just going to follow Jesus. And so, even in their differences, he wants them to know, listen, this petty, and I hate to use the word petty, but this divisiveness over pastors and leaders can be really, it's really a symbol of spiritual immaturity. It shows that you and I can drift like the wind. One thing is, I feel like I'm getting older and I've seen more things throughout the years, and I always respect people in the church who weather the storms that are basically the same regardless of who stands behind the pulpit or who is in whatever office, whether it be the chair of deacons or any other position of influence. There's always, at every church that I've pastored, there's people who they're always going to do what they do because they're doing it out of service for Christ, not for who is in charge, so to speak. And then there are others that are heavily swayed by who is in charge. And, that's a sad reality of where we're at. Because, Paul reminds us in the book of Romans that even though we are saved by the blood of Christ, we still struggle with the old man. There's still that wrestling with the flesh at times. And sometimes that flesh is out in those types of things. That's why no church is perfect. Amen? There's no such thing as perfect church because we're all made of broken people. Church is made up of sinners. But it is, nonetheless, Paul says it is hard pill to swallow at times when people want to fight over different people. And, I hate to say this. I really shouldn't say this whenever we're live streaming this. But, I've been reading this scripture for the last couple of days. And I've been dealing with some stuff back in, I'll just be honest with you, back in Central Kentucky that I don't really want to deal with. And what it boils down to is this very thing. There are people who want to follow certain pastors, and I'll just be honest with you. We have created in the evangelical subculture today this like celebrity pastor mindset of, and don't get me wrong, there are some great pastors out there that can do what I do far better, and I completely understand that. I would love to, I could listen to Alistair Begg read the phone book. That's just seriously. That's just. I'm glad that he doesn't read the phone book, but at the same time, it's this celebrity pastor culture that we've kind of created can filter into the local church and create even further divisiveness whenever someone doesn't fit our mold or fit, what we think the pastor ought to be. And, I'm not venting here. Everything is fine and dandy. But I'm just saying from previous experience and from what this text is saying, it is still a reality that people like to divide over its leadership. And Paul's saying, such divisiveness over who your pastor is or who your pastor isn't, it's foolish. Because the preacher or the one bringing God's word is just a servant. And, as long as Paul's argument here, and he's going to go on a little bit further, saying that as long as Christ is proclaimed, there's really nothing to fuss about. As long as the gospel is being presented and being made clear, there's not really a whole lot of argument there. Now, granted, there are plenty of people in the world that don't do that. My wife has been making fun of me here lately because, 6 months ago, you make decisions, Dennis, in your life that you regret, and then your wife has to pick at you about that. So one of the things that Leanna really, and I will have to say, I got this on, you get these subscriptions for XM radio, like whenever you buy stuff or something. Well, I subscribe to XM radio. She tells me, she finds it funny that my favorite channel is, I shouldn't even say this, and this is kind of me confessing my sins to you. My favorite radio station on XM is called Hair Nation, and which is it's an 80s rock. It plays 80s rock music all day. And Leanna told me the other day, she said, do you listen to Hair Nation because you have no hair? And it just, she got me on that one. But I will say, she got me back a couple days ago. I took her car somewhere, I think when I went to Somerset for the Kentucky Baptist Convention, and she was driving my car around for a day and a half, and so she decided to play a good one on me. She turned it to a channel of a preacher for whom I would probably never listen to, and so she put it on there, and she said, she told me, she said, I left something for you in your car. She said, well, I didn't really leave something in there. She said, I just made an adjustment that I hope that you find edifying and profitable for you. And so she got me back on that one. Hopefully my XM membership will expire soon, and we won't have to go through that. And but I, there are plenty of people out there that don't share the gospel and don't preach the gospel. I've been watching this documentary here in recent days about this woman. I don't know if you've heard of this woman, but her name was Gwen Shamblin. Any of y'all ever heard of Gwen Shamblin? She was a pastor in Brentwood, Tennessee. Started a church. Evidently, what her message was ask Jesus in your life so that you can lose weight. It was literally a weight loss. She had created this weight loss program, and so she basically her message was much like what a lot of prosperity preachers say today. If you trust Christ, nothing bad will happen to you. You'll have health and all this stuff. But on top of that, you will lose weight. And she died tragically 2018, I think, in a plane crash. And so since then, there's been a lot of negative publicity and a lot of documentaries that have come out from that. But, it was very sick, twisted ministry that she put. But there are people out there like that. And so I'm not discounting that. But if they proclaim the gospel, there's really no sense in fussing. Divisiveness, as Paul says, is silly because we're just workers in the field. Some people plant, some people water, but ultimately it's God who gives the increase. He goes on in verse 10. He says, according to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. So he gives a farming illustration. Now he gives this building metaphor in verses 10 through 15. And so this metaphor that he gives here, Paul turns his attention primarily to the teachers themselves, and it seems as if he's talking to the present and current leadership of the church at Corinth. And he warns them to build the church with imperishable materials. And so he's basically asking, what are we to build our foundation on? If we build it on anything else than Jesus, we're basically building it on straw and stubble. And that's the message that he's giving. He's said, for you as a church, don't make a big deal about who your pastor is. Don't be divisive over that. But then he says to the pastors, make sure you're giving the people the gospel, which is the firm foundation of faith in Christ. Probably been 15 years ago. I was back in Campbellsville as an undergrad student and preparing for ministry, and we had these conferences where you would have a lot of prominent Kentucky Baptist pastors or other folks who would come in and do these conferences. I love this one particular conference we had my senior year. There was a pastor down in Bowling Green that pastors a fairly large church in Bowling Green, and he's been very prominent in our state convention, been very, very good in leading the church to see people saved and to see a lot of people baptized while he's been there. But there was another fella in the church in our class that we were taking, and he gives his presentation, then he starts asking for questions. And so Steve being the pastor that he is and the very blunt fellow that he is, the student asked, he said, I've been preaching at this church for about 6 months, and I've ran across a lot of these church growth books and stuff like that, and I've just been throwing this stuff at them. If we're going to grow the church, we need to do this. If we're going to grow the church, do that. We need to do that. And he said, it just doesn't seem like the people are reacting well to it. And Pastor Steve looked at the fellow. He said, buddy, the best thing that you can do is take them books out back and burn them. And he said, what you need to do is quit preaching church growth, and next Sunday start preaching through the Gospel of John and just let the gospel do its work. And I still remember those words, and it still is true. His point is exactly what Paul is saying here. It's easy to build upon and use materials that are fluff, to make you feel good or draw a crowd or whatever. But Paul says you have to build with imperishable materials, which is the message of Christ. He goes on in verse 16, he uses this temple metaphor. He says, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. So here he gives this temple metaphor. And basically what Paul's doing is he's giving a stiff warning here to the church. He's describing in verse 16 the church as a temple. And so just think about it for a second. If you go back to the Old Testament, what does a temple symbolize? You remember? What was the purpose of the temple? Besides worship, besides sacrificing, what was the temple to invoke or show? God's presence, exactly. The tabernacle and the temple itself was to remind the people, just the building itself, that God dwelt among his people, that God was present and active among his people. And so that's the point that he's showing here. You are God's temple. You are a reminder to the rest of the world that God is here. And what Paul's getting at is the church is the people of God who possess the very presence of God. It's really easy for us not to feel that, right? But the truth is if we've been saved by the blood of Christ, if it is real with our soul, we have the very presence of God. And not only that, but we're also a living representation of the presence of God to those folks who don't know Jesus. And we have to be reminded of that. The church is indicative of God's presence among his people. And so Paul warns here those who seek to destroy the church through divisions. He's saying God will destroy you, those who seek to destroy the church. That's a pretty harsh warning, is it not? Because he views the church as a prized possession, as a bridegroom that's been prepared for as a bride that's been prepared for the bridegroom. And he's showing us here that God will spare no expense in protecting his church. And so he helps us to see this picture. And so the message here is simply this. It's a message of, listen, don't be divided over your leaders. They're just God's servants. Each of them have different roles. Remember that you're to build upon the foundation of Christ and nothing else. But also collectively remember this, that you have a mission to do, that God's given you His presence, and you're to be a representation of God's presence in the community for which God has placed you. I think that's a good reminder to us, especially for a divided church like Paul. You know, I used to have a guy used to tell me that, you know, when two fishermen get in a boat, if they don't fish, they fight. And he also kind of related that to the church. If the church don't fish, they fight. Had one deacon one time, I said that to in the middle of I don't forgot. Maybe it was a deacon's meeting, I don't forgot. He said, well, preacher, what about a church that fishes and fights? I'm like, just go outside. That's all I got to tell you. The truth is, if you claim you're fishing and fighting, you're probably doing one of two. You're probably doing one more than you are the other. That's all I got to tell you. And you're probably fighting more than you're fishing. Any questions? I feel like I've just been throwing this at you. I know I forgot to have prayer time at the beginning, so just show grace to me. We'll get to that at the end, okay? Any questions before we move on? All right, let's look at verse 18. It says, let no one deceive him. If anyone among you thinks that he is wise in this age, let him become a fool that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is folly with God, for it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. So let no one boast in men, for all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, or the world or life or death or the present or the future, all are yours. And ye are Christ, and Christ is God's. And so here he's kind of bringing the argument around. He's helping us to see that we all belong to Jesus. We all belong to Christ and for Christ. And so he seems to be, Paul gives this concluding argument on the first part of the problem, which is quarreling over leadership. And he confronts their wisdom here. Paul is saying the wisdom the Corinthians operate under is no wisdom at all. Their wisdom only belongs to this evil age. I mean, even the world divides over leaders. You know, I mean, y'all ever seen anybody get upset over the president before? I mean, or not get, or, you know, and, you know, you just start talking politics and it's like cats fighting. And he's helping us to see, listen, that logic is the world's logic, and that has no place in the kingdom of Christ. And he's helping us to see that type of wisdom is foolishness to the Lord. It's foolishness to God. And because of that, he confronts their wisdom, and then he immediately confronts their understanding of ownership. Paul is saying here that it's not that the Corinthians belong to Apollos or Paul or Peter, but he's saying that everybody, whether it's Paul, whether it's Apollos, whether it's Peter, whether it's you or me, we all belong to Jesus. And because of that, we all belong to God. And so he wants us to understand, listen, it's really easy to divide over people, over, you know, who's in charge or who's in, you know, the role of pastor or who's not in the role of pastor. And I get it. You know, there's some people, you know, their personalities just mesh well. You know, I can't change who I am. You can't change who you are. And I get it. Sometimes there's personality rubs that take place, but that should not detract each of us from putting our hands to the plow and working towards the Great Commission. And that's what Paul's saying here. Don't let such things creep into the church and divide you in unnecessary ways, because I promise the goal or the result of that will never be pleasing. And it always makes itself out. So I'm gonna leave it there. Any comments or questions? We'll pick back up in chapter 4 next week. But I know they are. I'm going to turn my